As we learned last time, ultimately Charles chose to follow the Pope's dictate of Luther's excommunication through the Edict of Worms because he feared the political ramifications of a fractured Christian church. Turns out, Charles was right to be so concerned. No sooner had Luther split with the Catholic Church been solidified than Protestant nobles ruling mostly northern German states sought ways to undermine Charles's authority. Unfortunately for Charles, their efforts blended into the wars Charles was already fighting. While the leaders of the various reform movements were meeting to discuss their differences around Germany, Charles was dealing with existential challenges to his rule. Throughout the 1520s, Charles fought wars with France as the French king, Francis I, tried to take some of Charles's land both in the Netherlands and in northern Italy, the Italian Wars, of which we learned previously. In 1527, Charles had won a victory against the ailing League of Cognac, which included Pope Clement VII as political ruler of the Papal States, Henry VIII, Francis I, and the Italian city-states of Florence, Venice, and Milan. The League had been formed specifically to stop the encroachment of Habsburg imperial power in northern Italy, so Charles's victory was particularly sweet. The victory was won in part because Charles's troops had sacked Rome, forcing Pope Clement VII, a Medici, to flee to a fortified castle in the city. Charles held him as a guest in that castle until 1528. Quick note. This 1528 is the same year in which Henry VIII, a member of the League of Cognac, tried to petition Pope Clement VII for the annulment from his first wife, Catherine, who happened to be Charles's aunt. You can see why Henry thought it would be easy to obtain his annulment, as he was at that time allied with Clement, and why Charles was easily able to influence Clement's decision to turn down Henry's request, but more on the English Reformation later. Additionally, in 1529, at about the same time that Luther and Zwingli and their followers were making their way to Marburg for the Marburg Colloquy, Ottoman forces began their siege of Vienna. How in the world did the Ottomans come to play a role in this Reformation intrigue? Well, beginning in 1526, Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman forces had begun a march across Eastern Europe. That year, the Ottomans had defeated King Louis of Hungary, leaving that throne empty and continuing their march across Hungary and into Austria. Well, some Catholic Hungarians sought support from the Holy Roman Empire. Accordingly, Charles's brother Ferdinand married King Louis's widow and became the King of Hungary. This title would then enter the Habsburg family's long list of noble and royal titles. Other Hungarian nobles, however, feared Austrian overlordship and chose a Transylvanian noble, John, as their king. Eventually, in exchange for recognition by the Ottomans, John's descendants would agree to rule Hungary as a principality, the Principality of Transylvania, as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. And then the Ottoman Empire would just take over the southern part of what once had been the Kingdom of Hungary. As the Ottoman forces advanced, Charles appealed for military aid from the German princes of his empire, but it was not forthcoming. The Protestant German nobles essentially ignored the request. As a result, only areas directly under Charles's control, his patrimony, Spain, Bohemia, and his varied German states, sent help to Vienna. The people of Vienna themselves fought under the leadership of a German mercenary hired to coordinate the city's defense. In the end, the defensive forces were able to repel several Ottoman attacks, and then unseasonably cold weather for early October hit, including rain and snowfall, and this forced the Ottoman army to retreat. And then the continued bad weather, along with sporadic attacks by imperial forces, plagued the Ottoman army until they returned to Ottoman Hungary. In 1530, with the Ottoman threat averted, Charles demanded that the protesting German nobles, the ones who hadn't sent troops to Vienna, explain to him their religious convictions and, by extension, why they hadn't sent soldiers. That explanatory document is known now as the Augsburg Confession. This document includes 28 articles, of which 21 are theses, or positive statements of what Lutherans believe, and 7 are antitheses, negative statements, which clarified their stance against perceived abuses of the Roman Catholic Church. It is this document which specifically addressed clerical hierarchy, with Lutherans saying that there was no hierarchy among the clergy, that monastic vows were not needed or accepted, and that their clergy could marry. And it was also this document which rejected 5 of the Roman Catholic Church's 7 sacraments, outlining that Lutherans were keeping just 2 sacraments, baptism and communion. If you look at this poster, which celebrated the signing of the Augsburg Confession, you can see that they're trying to draw a connection directly to their Jewish heritage. You can see the Ark of the Covenant right here and the obvious menorah up at the top of that poster. Now, the German princes who signed on to the Augsburg Confession also separately agreed to a military alliance in the case that Charles decided to make a move against them. This alliance was called the Schmalkaldic League. Now, Charles barely had time to breathe between the end of the Ottoman War and the formation of this Schmalkaldic League. The League hoped to overthrow Charles and disband the Holy Roman Empire, thus giving each individual German prince more power. They began a revolt in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, even allying with the King of Denmark at one point, and they acted together as a bloc during meetings of the Imperial Diet, hampering Charles's ability to employ diplomatic means to address various domestic and international disputes. Well, Charles responded essentially defensively in an effort to keep his empire together, but it wasn't easy, for the Ottoman threat loomed again. Even though imperial forces had defeated the Ottomans in 1529, Suleiman continued to involve himself in European politics. Down but not out, Suleiman lent support to Protestants throughout Europe. Suleiman felt a genuine connection to Protestant Christians who, like Muslims, often spoke out against the depiction of God in art, and whose worship revolved around prayer and biblical recitation, and at that time anyway, no music. Accordingly, Suleiman supported the Schmalkaldic League politically and sometimes monetarily. Then, after 1536, Charles had to deal with not only Suleiman's political meddling, but also the return of a military Ottoman menace, this time in the form of the Franco-Ottoman alliance between Francis I and Suleiman. Both Francis and Suleiman were interested in trying to destabilize Habsburg power. Francis, because he was surrounded by Habsburgs, Spain to his south and the Holy Roman Empire to his north, and Suleiman because he wanted to expand his empire further into Europe. But Suleiman was also passionately interested in the Jewish question in Europe. Remember, in 1492, when Spain had expelled the Jews, many of those families had initially fled to Portugal, and when Portugal became unfriendly after 1497, those families fled to northern Italy, as the Italian city-states welcomed Jewish families, especially if they were wealthy. However, in the 15-teens and early 1520s, some of these Jewish families, the ones who had reportedly converted to Christianity in Spain or Portugal, came under investigation by the Roman Inquisition in Italy for having not really converted. Some of these Jews were even imprisoned for heresy. Suleiman, under counsel from his Jewish advisors, was willing to welcome these Jewish families into the Ottoman Empire to settle them in Salonika, as the empire would benefit from their business. He sent formal petitions to various Italian city-states demanding that these Jews be released and allowed to come to the Ottoman Empire, or else. Charles repeatedly approached his imperial diet with the request for more funds to help him fight his wars against the Turks, but the Protestant German princes who formed the Schmalkaldic League blocked his requests, since they saw Ottoman expansion as a check on Habsburg, and thus Catholic, power in Europe. Now, meanwhile, in the 1530s, Martin Luther would be plagued by ill health, but nonetheless traveled Europe in an effort to oversee the expansion of his Reformed theology and to continue trying to bring the now multiple Protestant denominations all back together. In 1541, Charles encouraged the papacy in its efforts to find compromise with Luther and his group of Protestants at the Regensburg Conference, sometimes called the Diet of Regensburg or the Colloquy of Regensburg. The discussion centered around the Augsburg Confession. The Catholic representative, Gasparo Contarini, a cardinal, sought to focus on the main point of contention between Lutherans and Catholics at that time, Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession, which dealt with the issue of justification. Remember, that means salvation. The Lutherans reiterated their belief that, at baptism, a person is recognized as a true believer in God and has thus gained justification through their faith, sola fide. Catholics reiterated their belief that, while baptism was an initial point of justification, the introduction to God and true faith, A person was still responsible for their final justification, that they were justified by doing a lifetime of God's will, God's good works. Contarini drafted a compromise which recognized the primacy of faith in justification, but added that good works, and thus the sacraments, were important in maintaining God's grace throughout one's life. This and other compromises were then sent back to Rome for the Pope and to Luther, so that those two men might approve these compromises. However, both Luther and the Pope refused to do so, each insisting on other concessions before finally approving the Regensburg Articles, and so this meeting had no positive ending. Incidentally, in 1999, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation, the largest organization of Lutheran churches, issued a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which is essentially a rewriting of Contarini's Compromise of 1541. In 2006, the World Methodist Council also signed on to this agreement. This means that all of these denominations now agree on the method of justification in Christianity. It just took nearly 500 years to reach this compromise. The failure of the Regensburg Conference had dire consequences for Charles. In the 1540s, the Schmalkaldic League would redouble its efforts against him. Charles would win a decisive victory against the League at the Battle of Mulberg in 1547, and since the Catholic Counter-Reformation had begun only 2 years prior, Charles stalled for time, hoping that the Council of Trent would develop some compromises with the Protestants. In the meantime, he willingly made some concessions to his Protestant princes in 1548. Sadly, Luther wasn't alive to see these concessions made. In 1546, he traveled to mediate a disagreement between two Reformed princes when he caught a chill and died. His last letter to Kate, written at this time, illustrated his deep uncertainty about the fate of the Reformation. "Who knows what God will do?" he wrote. In 1552, despite their defeat 5 years prior, the Protestant princes again rebelled, this time aided by the new French king, Henry II. Fortunately for Charles, the Ottomans didn't help at this time, as Suleiman was focused on his war with the Persian Safavid Empire. Charles, now increasingly ill, delegated more and more of the strategy and day-to-day responsibility in Germany to his brother, Ferdinand, who fought skirmishes against the Protestant princes. Finally, in September of 1555, Charles called the leaders of the Schmalkaldic League together to meet with him to discuss peace in Augsburg. His brother Ferdinand negotiated the treaty's terms. The resulting Peace of Augsburg granted religious and political legitimacy to Lutherans in the Holy Roman Empire. There were 3 principles to the Peace of Augsburg formally adopted on the 25th of September, 1555. With a simple guiding principle, Cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, their religion, Charles was able to end the fighting which had plagued his empire since the start of the Protestant Reformation, since the start of his reign. This would become the most important principle of the peace. The second principle was the Ecclesiastical Reservation, which stated that if the highest-ranking clergy member of a state changed his religion moving forward, that the people of that state would not have to do so. They could retain their original faith. The third principle was known as Ferdinand's Declaration, as Ferdinand, chief negotiator of the peace, inserted it into the treaty on his own authority. This principle declared that individual knights or noblemen and some cities within various states were exempt from religious uniformity, if the Reformed theology had been practiced by them or by that city since the middle of the 1520s. This principle effectively created cities where Lutherans and Catholics lived openly side by side. Still, the treaty wasn't perfect. Anyone who practiced any of the other Reformed theologies, most notably Calvinism, which, as your textbook specifies, emerged in Switzerland in the 1530s, and Anabaptism, were still considered heretics in the Holy Roman Empire, and thus princes who might choose to subscribe to either of those doctrines were not to be considered legal rulers. Just 1 month after that meeting at Augsburg, Charles formally abdicated his multiple thrones. At the handover, he was so ill that he had to be supported as he stood. His chosen support was one of his favorite young nobles and advisors, William, the Prince of Orange and Nassau, in the modern-day Netherlands. More on this William later. Charles had suffered from epilepsy his entire life, and then in his late 40s, he had been increasingly suffering from gout, probably due to his meat-heavy diet. Now he was in his mid-50s. He was tired of fighting and tired of ruling, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life in quiet contemplation. So, Charles divided his territories. He gave his Spanish Empire, which included the Western Hemisphere, to his son Philip II, who, at 28, had essentially been the regent of Spain since the 1540s. This wasn't a really big shift. The Habsburg lands in Central Europe, though, went to Charles's brother, who at 52 was just 3 years younger than Charles himself. The imperial diet, however, would not recognize Charles's abdication until May of 1558, so Charles would remain, officially, the Holy Roman Emperor until then. Charles retired to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura in Spain. He lived in a simple monk's cell, the walls of which were reportedly covered in clocks. He was fascinated by that technology. He maintained a lively correspondence with old friends and advisors, even though his health worsened. The last few years of his life, Charles's gout was so bad that he often had to be carried around the monastery on a litter. The monks at Yuste built special ramps so that he might walk the grounds on his own. Yuste might then be the very first building in Europe to be handicapped accessible. Charles died almost exactly 3 years after the Peace of Augsburg, in September 1558, from malaria. Just a few months prior to his death in May, the imperial diet formally recognized his abdication and elected Ferdinand, Charles's brother, as the new Holy Roman Emperor. He became Ferdinand I. At the end of 1558, the initial push of the Reformation was beginning to fade, at least in Central Europe. The movement that Martin Luther had begun about 50 years earlier had resulted both in genuine reforms of Christian doctrine and challenges to a political institution, this Holy Roman Empire, that seemed to some like a medieval holdover. With the start of the Catholic Counter-Reformation in 1545, there was clearly an impetus to continue the reforming efforts wholesale. So it shouldn't be too surprising that the 16th and 17th centuries would continue to see this mix of religious and political warfare, right?